For centuries, we have searched for evil in the shadows, in the back alleys, in the desperate slums, and within the isolated asylum. But the most predatory kind of killer often hides in plain sight, wearing a mask of piety, motherhood, or charm. In 1809, there was Mary Bateman, the Yorkshire witch, whose greed was cloaked in the rituals of the occult. She promised health and salvation, but delivered agonizing death by poison, trading false blessings for stolen shillings. Decades later, in the suffocating poverty of Victorian England, Sarah Jane Whiteling perfected a different kind of horror. She was entrusted with the lives of small, dependent children. She was a baby farmer who saw the vulnerable not as a trust, but as a liability, a problem solved quickly and quietly with toxic precision. Then, the evil evolved. In the sun-drenched glamour of 1920s Los Angeles, Louise Peete shed the rags of desperation for the silk of high society. She didn't need poison or magic. She simply needed to assume your identity. Her crimes were modern: theft, confidence games, and the cold-blooded disposal of bodies buried in the rose gardens of the very homes she stole. 3 women, 3 centuries. The common thread is absolute deception. This is the story of how they exploited every social weakness, from religious faith to maternal trust, to feed a limitless, insatiable greed. This is a case preserved from the latter half of the 18th century. So close your eyes for a moment and we will find our way not to the old city of Bristol, but to the fields and byroads of Yorkshire. Around 1768, in the little village of Asenby near Thirsk in North Yorkshire, a farmer's daughter named Mary Harker was born into a world of hard soil and narrow means. The houses there were low and rough, with smoke-darkened beams and beaten earth floors where the smell of damp wool and stored turnips drifted together in the colder months. Her father worked the land, but the land gave back only enough to keep hunger in check, rather than truly away. There is no careful record of her schooling or early accomplishments, only the knowledge that she grew up in a household where every pair of hands was expected to contribute. In such cottages, children rose in chilly air, pulling on rough garments that never quite dried between washings, and learned early the small disciplines of obedience and thrift. As she grew into a tall, capable young woman, Mary left the cramped family dwelling for service in nearby Thirsk and other towns, exchanging one set of plain walls for another. It was there, among other people's possessions and purses, that the first hints of the life she would lead began quietly to show themselves. In the 1780s, as Mary Harker moved from one position of service to another in Thirsk and neighbouring towns, a pattern took shape that employers began to notice. Small items went missing: coins, pieces of clothing, small stores of food. She was dismissed more than once for theft, sent away from kitchens that smelled of broth and yeast, back into lanes where the wind cut across open fields. Yet she did not return to the strict poverty of her parents' cottage for long. Service had shown her that other people's fears and credulity might be as exploitable as their unlocked drawers. Around 1790 to 1792, she married a man named John Bateman, described as a cartwright or general labourer, and took his name. There were no children officially recorded from this union, and the pair eventually settled in Leeds, a town thick with smoke and industry, where narrow streets wound between workshops and lodging houses. By the end of that decade, they were living in poor districts near Timble Bridge, and later in the Marsh Lane area, where walls were stained by damp and the stairs inside cheap dwellings creaked under many feet. It was in Leeds, from the later 1790s onward, that Mary Bateman began to turn more openly from petty theft to a darker trade: charms, potions, and promises sold in the close air of small rooms to people whose worries made them willing to believe. By the turn of the century, Mary Bateman had left behind the plain name of a farmer's daughter and begun to fashion herself into something more ominous in the alleys of Leeds. From about 1792 onward, she dealt in what people then called cunning work, selling charms to avert misfortune, powders to cure illness, and written directions said to break curses. In the cramped front rooms where she received her clients, the air was close with the smell of cheap tallow and unwashed clothes, the walls stained by years of smoke. People came to her with trembling hands and faces lined by worry, and she met them with an air of grave assurance that seemed, to many, like power. Between 1803 and 1804, she devised one of her most notorious frauds. In a mean district of Leeds, she announced that a hen in her possession had begun to lay eggs marked with the words, "Christ is coming." Curious and fearful crowds came to see this creature, paying small sums for the privilege and for protective charms. Behind the spectacle lay a cruel trick. She wrote the words on eggshells with a corrosive ink and forced the eggs back into the hen's body so that they could be laid again before witnesses. In the damp courts and yards of Leeds, the story spread quickly, feeding both superstition and her purse. By 1806, she had moved beyond mere display to a more deadly intimacy with her victims' lives. That year, a couple from Bramley, near Leeds, William and Rebecca Perigo, came to believe they had been bewitched. They sought out Mary, who now claimed to act on behalf of an unseen gentlewoman called Miss Blythe, a figure who existed only in her imagination and in letters she herself composed. Through these letters, written in a firm hand and delivered in secrecy, Miss Blythe demanded money, clothing, and household goods to be placed in Mary's care as part of a supposed spiritual remedy. And then, as the Perigos yielded more of their small security, powders began to arrive. White substances Mary instructed them to mix into their daily food to counteract the curse that, she insisted, lay upon their house. As 1806 turned into 1807, the Perigos world grew steadily narrower under Mary Bateman's guidance. The powders she sent, said to be part of a holy remedy prescribed by the unseen Miss Blythe, were in truth mixtures of corrosive substances later found to contain arsenic and mercury. She directed William and Rebecca to stir these into their food day after day, telling them that any pain or sickness was a sign that the evil working against them was being driven out. In their modest Bramley home, where the fire smoked in the grate and damp crept up the walls, they ate their meals with increasing unease, yet still obeyed. By the autumn of 1806, the powders had become a regular part of their fare. Both husband and wife suffered bouts of illness, griping pains, weakness, and strange sensations in their limbs. William grew thinner, his face taking on a sallow cast, his movements slower. Rebecca too felt her strength ebb, but the letters from Miss Blythe, written in Mary's own hand, urged them to persevere and to trust. In 1807, another preparation arrived from Leeds, a mixture of honey and rum, accompanied by written instructions that it was to be taken in careful doses as a final measure to break the spell. On 1807, and again on the following day, Rebecca took the draughts as directed in the close air of the little house where the light fell weakly through small paned windows. As evening drew on, her condition worsened with frightening speed. Cramps seized her, she was racked by vomiting, and her body seemed to fail in every limb. William, himself weakened, could only watch as her breathing grew laboured and her strength drained away. On 1807, in that cramped and humble room, Rebecca Perigo died, leaving her husband alive but grievously impaired, his own body damaged by the same regimen he had obediently followed. In the months after 1807, the little house at Bramley seemed emptied of more than one life. Rebecca was gone, and William Perigo moved through the rooms as a man whose body and mind had both been shaken. He remained weak, his limbs unreliable, his face thinned and drawn, yet he continued for a time to follow the instructions that had been pressed upon him. The powders, the strange regimen, the letters from Miss Blythe, carried by Mary, all of it lingered like a shadow over the low ceilings and worn furniture. But as the seasons turned, a different kind of unease began to take hold. William's strength did not return as he had been promised. The blessings he had been told to expect did not appear. Instead, there was only persistent frailty and the memory of his wife's agonizing decline after the doses of honey and rum. By 1807 and into 1808, suspicions slowly stiffened in him. He began to keep back some of the powders rather than consuming them, and he preserved the letters that Mary had brought. with their confident assurances and demands for money and goods. These scraps of paper and remnants of powders, kept in a modest home that still smelled faintly of sickness and smoke, would become his defense against the woman he had trusted. At last he went to the authorities, laying out his story and the physical tokens of it. The letters in the same hand. The strange substances pressed upon him as remedies. The law moved with a deliberation matching his own slow awakening. On 09/17/1808, officers went to Marsh Lane in Leeds, to the house where Mary Bateman lived. In the close, cluttered rooms, they found items traced to various victims and materials consistent with the Perigos's account. There, in the dwelling where she had built her trade on fear and false promises, Mary Bateman was arrested and taken into custody, the silence of her own home closing behind her as the door was shut. At the York Lent Assizes of 1809, the case of Mary Bateman came formally before the law. On 03/17/1809, the proceedings opened in York, beneath high ceilings and dark beams that echoed with the murmur of a crowded court. Spectators had come in from town and country, filling the galleries until the air grew warm and stale, thick with breath and the faint scent of damp woolen coats. In the dock stood Mary Bateman, now about 40 or a little more, her figure solid but her face set, the farmer's daughter from Asenby, transformed into the woman people called the Yorkshire Witch. She had no counsel to speak for her, no advocate rose to untangle the net of her actions. The prosecution, led by Park before Mr. Justice Sir Simon Le Blanc, set out the history of the Perigos dealings with her. William Perigo, his body still bearing the mark of what he had swallowed, told the court of his and Rebecca's fear of being bewitched, their visits to Mary at Leeds, and the letters from the supposed Miss Blythe that Mary had delivered. These letters, now produced, were all in the same unmistakable hand. He described the steady draining away of their money and goods, the powders they had been told to take daily, and the honey and rum mixture sent shortly before Rebecca's death on 05/25/1807. Medical witnesses spoke in quiet, formal language of the symptoms described and of the nature of the powders William had preserved. They identified arsenic within them, a poison whose effects matched the agonies suffered in that little Bramley house. Other witnesses recounted how Mary had traded for years on superstition and fear, selling charms and cures from poor rooms in Leeds. Mary herself attempted a defense, denying murderous intent and suggesting that the substances had been harmless or misunderstood, but with no skilled advocate to shape her words, her efforts were halting and unpersuasive. For 3 days the evidence was laid out, thread by thread, before judge and jury. On 03/20/1809, the jury retired and returned with a single, stark conclusion: guilty of willful murder. The judge, in grave tones, pronounced the sentence that followed such a verdict in that age, that she be hanged by the neck until dead. On 03/20/1809, the same day the verdict was given, the sentence on Mary Bateman was carried out at York. Around noon she was brought to the new drop gallows at York Castle, where a great crowd, estimated by different voices at between 5,000 and 20,000, had gathered to see her die. The air was chill, the stones of the castle walls holding the damp of the season. From the scaffold she would have seen only a sea of faces, upturned and waiting. Accounts from the time describe no wild frenzy, but a woman who maintained a composure that many found unsettling, the set of her features giving little away as the noose was placed about her neck and the drop fell. Her body did not pass quietly into the earth. Instead, it was taken to York County Hospital for dissection, part of the judicial sentence then imposed on certain killers. There, in a cold room smelling of spirits and decay, surgeons laid her open before a smaller but no less intent audience. Strips of her skin were later said to have been tanned and cut into charms against evil, sold to those who half feared and half admired the power they believed she had wielded. Her skeleton was preserved, and for more than 2 centuries remained on display in Leeds, a stark reminder in bone of the woman once called the Yorkshire Witch. Her name endures in the history of Yorkshire crime and English superstition, a cunning woman who slipped from petty theft into elaborate fraud and finally into poison and murder. Yet even now, questions cling to her story like damp to stone. Was Mary Bateman only a cold deceiver, steadily tightening her hold on the credulous until their bodies failed? Or was she also a product of a world steeped in fear, poverty, and belief in invisible forces? Did the rope at York Castle truly resolve the harm she had done, or did it simply satisfy a society that wanted its monsters to be visible and finite? And in an age that prides itself on reason, are we sure that nothing like her trade, built on anxiety, blind trust, and the quiet misery of the desperate, could find new forms behind other doors in other narrow rooms? We are about to dissect a tragedy born out of the fevered years of the 19th century. So take a deep breath, and we will step into the crowded streets and narrow courts of Philadelphia by way of a life that began far from there. The exact date of her birth has not survived, but around 1848, a girl who would later call herself Sarah Jane Whiteling came into the world, probably in Germany, though at other times she claimed American origins. Whatever the truth of that first place, she grew up among working people whose lives were measured in wages, not in dreams. Her childhood left no careful record of parents' names or trades, only the outline of a class. Families that shared beds and bedrooms, where the smell of damp clothing drying by the stove mixed with coal smoke and thin soup. As a young woman, she went westward, part of the restless movement of the time, and by the later 1860s she was in the American Midwest, where streets turned to mud after rain and wooden houses creaked in the wind. Schooling, if she had any, was brief. She could read and sign her name, but her days were shaped more by work than by books. From the beginning, money was never quite enough, and she learned early how quickly a roof and a meal could depend upon the favor of employers and the staying power of a man's wages. In 1868, as the United States pressed deeper into the industrial age, Sarah Jane Whiteling stood up in Clinton, Iowa, and married a man named Tom Brown. He was a working man of no great standing, one more figure in a country of restless movement and rough opportunity. They lived first in Iowa, then in Chicago, where the air was thick with smoke from factories, and the wooden houses stood close together, their stairways worn smooth by many feet. The Great Fire that tore through Chicago in 1871 drove them, like many others, onward again, and in time they settled in Philadelphia. There, fortune turned harder. Brown was arrested and imprisoned for highway robbery in the Eastern State Penitentiary, and he died serving his sentence. Widowhood, when it came, did not bring quiet, but only a different kind of uncertainty. Sarah entered into a connection with a man named Thomas Story, who kept an oyster saloon in the city and bore a daughter, Bertha. Later, in 1880, she married again, this time to a streetcar conductor and cigar worker named Jane Whiteling. She brought the infant Bertha into this new household, and in 1886 another child was born, a son named William, called Willie. By the late 1880s, the four of them lived together in a narrow Philadelphia house where the wallpaper lifted in damp corners, the stair treads creaked, and the smell of boiled food and coal hung constantly in the stale air. By the beginning of 1888, the Whiteling household was one among many in Philadelphia where respectability rested on very narrow means. John worked as a carpenter and cigar maker at different times, his pay never lavish and never certain. The family's rented rooms were small and low-ceilinged, the wallpaper stained by damp and smoke, the stair rail polished by the same hands that trembled when the rent came due. In winter, a thin fire smoldered in the grate, barely strong enough to push back the cold that crept under the door. In that year, it was later reported, Sarah began to speak of another man and of the possibility of a different life, one not burdened by husband and children and the daily struggle to keep them fed. There was no insurance policy upon John's life, no hoard of savings waiting in a bank. There was only the arithmetic of a poor household, food, fuel, clothing, and the constant drag of small debts. Yet in the closing days of 1888, she went to a local shop and bought a packet of rough-on rats, a common rat poison whose chief strength lay in arsenic. Soon after, John became ill. What began as sickness of the stomach grew into violent attacks of vomiting and pain. He weakened visibly. His once solid frame seemed to shrink. His cheeks hollowed. His step grew unsteady when he tried to cross the cramped room. Neighbors were aware that something was wrong, hearing the sounds of retching and groaning through the thin walls, catching glimpses of a man now too feeble to rise easily from his bed. Sarah was seen moving about the house, carrying food and drink, smoothing the covers, her expression tight and drawn. On 04/22/1888, in that same suffocating atmosphere of stale air and sour smells, John Whiteling died, leaving his widow, 9-year-old Bertha, and 2-year-old Willie in a house that suddenly felt both emptier and far more precarious. In the days that followed John's death on 04/22/1888, the little house did not have time to grow truly quiet. Bertha, 9 years old, soon began to suffer from the same cruel disturbance of the stomach. Neighbors later spoke of hearing a child retching behind the thin partition walls, the sound sharp at first, then weaker, broken by whimpers. A girl who had once played in the street was now mostly a pale shape in a narrow bed, her small hands clutching at the coverlet. Sarah was seen going up and down the worn stairs, carrying cups and plates, her skirts brushing the boards, her face set and tired. On 04/27/1888, Bertha died in that same close air. There was another funeral, another small coffin lowered into the ground. For a few days, only Willie's thin voice sounded in the rooms. Then, early in 05/1888, the little boy also fell ill, with the same bouts of vomiting and collapse. On 05/05/1888, Willie too lay still, and at last the Whiteling house was truly silent. It was Willie's death on 05/05/1888 that finally broke the uneasy pattern. The physician who had attended the family, now called once more to the same narrow house, was confronted with the third body in less than 2 weeks, all taken in much the same way: sudden distress, violent vomiting, cramps and swift collapse. The child's little form was light in his arms, the limbs already slack, the cheeks gone slack and pale. The room where he lay felt used up by illness. Bedding sour with sweat, air thick from too many nights of poor ventilation and too little cleaning, the stove cold in the corner. The doctor could no longer accept these deaths as the work of chance or of ordinary sickness. He reported his suspicions to the authorities, and the machinery of inquiry began to move. Orders were given that the bodies of John, Bertha and Willie be exhumed. From the earth they were taken to be examined under the stern, impersonal light of the post-mortem room, where stone floors held the chill and the sharp scent of disinfectant tried and failed to entirely cover the odor of decay. In the organs of all three, the examiners found unmistakable quantities of arsenic. The pattern was too exact, the similarity of the symptoms too complete. These were not the scattered misfortunes of a poor family, but a chain of deaths linked by a single poison. On 05/19/1888, the police returned to the Whiteling house, now stripped of the noises of family life. In their search, they found, hidden beneath Sarah's bed, a packet of rough-on rats, a commercial rat poison known to consist largely of arsenic. With the results of the exhumations before them and the poison discovered under her own roof, the officers took Sarah Jane Whiteling into custody, leading her out in the days and nights that followed her arrest on 05/19/1888. Sarah Jane Whiteling was held while the evidence around her hardened into a case. After 3 days in custody, questioned and confronted with the results of the exhumations and the packet of poison found beneath her bed, she confessed that she had bought rough-on rats near the end of 03/1888 and had mixed it little by little into the food of her husband and children. It was later reported that she spoke of wanting to free herself from the burdens of her household in order to pursue another attachment, though the man she named denied any such understanding. There was no hint of insurance policies or other financial gain, only the stark suggestion that ordinary domestic obligations had come to feel like a chain. In 07/1888, She was brought before the court of Oye and Termina in Philadelphia to stand trial for the murder of her daughter, Bertha. The courtroom was crowded, heat and the close press of bodies thickened the air, and those who came out of curiosity sat elbow to elbow with those who came out of outrage. Sarah stood in the dock, a slight figure in plain prison clothing, her face drawn, the flesh fallen a little from her cheeks, her eyes fixed mostly downward as the formal charge of murder was read out and her name echoed in the high chamber. The prosecution laid before the jury a grim and orderly account. A packet of arsenical rat poison bought in 03-1888, the successive illnesses and deaths of John on 04-22-1888, Bertha on 04-27-1888, and Willie on 05-05-1888, the exhumations and the arsenic found in each body. Doctors described the symptoms they had seen and the post-mortem results, speaking in careful, unemotional terms of organs marked by poison. The rough on rats, discovered beneath her bed, was produced as a mute but powerful exhibit. For the defense, little could be contested in the way of fact. Her counsel sought instead to frame her actions within the narrow, suffocating life she had led. A poor woman, often on the margin, her reason, it was suggested, overborne by misery and unwholesome fancies. When she spoke in the dock, she did not dispute that the poison had been given, but tried to place herself as a sinner, seeking forgiveness rather than a calculating monster, her voice reported as low and troubled. The jury, however, after hearing all, returned a verdict of guilty. The judge, bound more by law than by pity, sentenced her to death by hanging. She was to be executed within the walls of Moyamensing prison. On 06-25-1889, within the high grey walls of Moyamensing prison in Philadelphia, the sentence pronounced in 07-1888 was carried out. In the early hours, as the city beyond the prison slowly stirred to life, Sarah Jane Whiteling was led from her cell to the scaffold. Contemporary accounts do not speak of any violent outburst. Rather, they describe a small, pale woman, her features sharpened by confinement, walking with a subdued, steady step. Whatever words passed her lips at the last, if any, have not endured with certainty. The mechanism of the law completed its work quickly, and her body was taken down and given over, the life of the woman once known as Sarah Jane McQuillan brought to an abrupt close. Her execution was notable. She was the first woman to be hanged in Pennsylvania since the early 1840s, and she would be the last woman in that state to die by the rope before the electric chair was introduced. Newspapers of the time dwelt on the horror of a mother who had poisoned her husband and both children, not for money but, by her own admission, to free herself for another man who denied any shared intention. Some voices saw in her a cold and calculating figure. Others, more quietly, saw a narrow life, cramped by poverty and disappointment, until her sense of duty had withered into something dark and unrecognizable. So the record leaves us with a narrow Philadelphia house where 3 chairs fell empty in swift succession, and a prison yard where one life ended in the name of justice. Was Sarah Jane Whiteling simply a hand that steadily measured poison into food, or a worn and wayward soul crushed by years of want and discontent? Did the gallows at Moyamensing truly balance the scale her crimes had overturned, or did it only silence the one person who might have explained how such thoughts first took root? And in a world where small rooms, thin walls and quiet despair still exist, is it impossible that some colder echo of her story could yet unfold, unseen behind another closed door? We are about to dissect a tragedy born out of the restless American industrial age. So take a deep breath and we will begin, far from California, on the red soil of rural Louisiana. On 09-20-1880 in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, a girl named Louise Pressler was born into a family that stood a little above the grinding poverty around them. Her father owned and edited a local newspaper, a small operation where ink and paper turned gossip and politics into print, and where the clatter of the press mixed with the dust and heat of a southern town. The Presslers were not grand, but they were comfortable compared with many of their neighbors, a household where there were books in the house and where a girl could expect more than bare subsistence. The rooms of her childhood would have held the faint sourness of damp cloth after summer storms, the dry smell of paper and ink from her father's work, and the murmur of adult voices discussing local affairs. Louise received more education than many girls of her generation. She learned to read and write with ease, and she grew into a poised, self-possessed young woman, used to better dresses and more polished company than most in her parish. Yet even in that setting, where the walls were sound and the table well supplied, there were undercurrents that cannot now be fully traced. A restless desire for movement, for admiration, for a life larger than the one promised by the quiet streets of Bienville parish. In time, that restlessness would carry her westward into rooms far less respectable and choices far more dangerous. By her late teens, Louise had already outgrown the quiet confines of Bienville parish. She was sent to a private school in New Orleans, a mark of her family's means, but even there the pattern that would shadow her life began to show. Before long, she was expelled for theft and misconduct, a girl with quick hands and a taste for admiration moving through corridors that smelled of chalk dust and perfume, leaving behind murmurs and disapproval rather than diplomas. In 1903, she married a traveling salesman, Henry Bosley. On paper, it was a respectable match, a well-brought-up Southern woman and a commercial man who moved from town to town with his samples and his hopes. 4 years later, in 1907, he was dead by his own hand after finding her in bed with another man, a hotel tragedy that left behind a body in a cheap room and a widow who did not stay long in mourning. Louise drifted into the high-priced red-light world of Texas, moving through parlors where the air was thick with cigar smoke and scent, taking money and jewelry from men who mistook her poise for innocence. By 1911, she had reached Boston under an assumed name, insinuating herself into wealthy homes, running up debts, and slipping away before the damage fully settled. In 1913, she married again, this time Harry Farote, a night clerk at a Dallas hotel. Within weeks, he too was dead by his own hand, leaving behind a safe mysteriously lightened of its jewels and a widow who moved on once more. 2 years later, in 1915, she married for yet another time to a Denver salesman named Richard Peete and soon presented him with a daughter, Frances Anne, in 1916. A small, breathing proof that this graceful, restless woman could also be a mother as well as a wife. By the early 1900s, the young woman once known as Loafy Louise Pressler had begun to live far from the ordered world of her father's print shop. Between 1903 and 1906, she was in Texas, in the red light districts of Dallas and Waco, working as a high-priced prostitute among parlors where heavy curtains kept out the sun and the air smelled of cigar smoke, perfume, and stale liquor. Men with money and position came and went, leaving banknotes, jewelry, and rumors behind. Her life passed from hotel room to rented room, each with the same worn carpet and faint, sour odor of too many bodies and too little fresh air. In 1906, a wealthy client in Texas was found dead, shot in the head as he lay in bed. Suspicion settled on Louise. She was known to have been close to him and to have benefited from his favor. Yet when the matter was examined, no indictment followed. There was talk of self-defense, of circumstances no jury would clearly see, and in the end the case faded. She moved on, leaving behind a corpse, a cloud of unanswered questions, and a pattern that would repeat. In 1913, she married Harry Farote in Denver, a salesman who believed he had found both companionship and refinement in this poised Southern woman. 5 days later, he was dead, hanging from a rope in a basement where the air was damp and cold, a suicide note speaking of ruin and despair laying his collapse at her door. Again, no charge was brought against her. 2 years after that, in 1915, she married for a third time, this time to an oil company employee named Richard Peete. They moved east to Boston for his work, and in 1916 she bore a daughter, Frances. Outwardly, it was a comfortable life, respectable address, solid furniture, a child in the nursery. Yet quarrels, absences, and money worries crept in. In 1920, while they were again in the West, Richard Peete shot himself in a hotel room, leaving his wife to explain his death as another tragedy that had simply befallen her. Before long, she had turned her attention toward Los Angeles, a city full of new fortunes and new chances, where in the spring of 1920 she would cross the path of a widowed mining engineer named Jacob C. Denton. In late 1920, Jacob Denton's house in Los Angeles, with its solid walls and shaded rooms, became the stage for his last recorded hours. He had agreed to let Louise Peete occupy part of the residence, and neighbors saw her moving in with trunks and boxes, her dresses and belongings taking their place among his. Denton was still in the house on the last day of 1920, a heavy-set man in his middle years, going about his business under the dark beams and tiled fireplaces of the Tudor-style home. Then, in the first days of 1920, he was seen no more. The windows remained curtained. Louise was observed coming and going, giving instructions to laborers to carry soil and materials down into the basement on the pretext of preparing it for some special use. Doors opened and closed, footsteps passed along the halls, the engine of Denton's automobile turned over in the yard, but his voice no longer sounded through the rooms. In that comfortable house, with its polished banisters and faint smell of dust and polish, a silence had settled around one missing man that no explanation truly relieved. For months after Jacob Denton's disappearance in early 1920, Louise Peete spoke calmly of him to those who inquired. She said he had gone to Mexico for his health or on business and did not wish to be disturbed. She lived in his house, drove his automobile, wore his jewelry, and signed his name to checks that kept the household going. The big home, once busy with his affairs, grew quieter, its rooms occupied by her and a few servants, its owner gone in body, but kept just barely present in her shifting stories. By the end of 1920, control of the house changed. New arrangements brought in workmen to put the property in order. In 1920, a gardener was set to digging in the basement area where Louise had once ordered soil to be laid, speaking of some special purpose. The cellar was cool and stale, the concrete floor patched and uneven. As the man dug near a place marked for planting, his spade struck something resistant. Clearing away the earth, he uncovered the outline of a human form. Police were called to the scene. In that low, dim space, they uncovered the remains of Jacob C. Denton, buried in a shallow grave under his own house. His body was clothed as if he had once risen from a chair and never returned. A .32 caliber bullet had entered his skull. His throat bore a deep cut that the examining physicians determined had not been the cause of death. The bullet had killed him. The knife had come after. The inquest room where the body was laid out was cold, the stone floor hard underfoot, the air carrying the mingled smells of disinfectant and decay. Doctors described the wound, the state of the remains, the likely time of death in relation to his disappearance. Bank officials came forward with records of checks signed in Denton's name after that date. Neighbors repeated the statements Louise had made about his supposed travels and injuries. Tracing these threads, detectives located Louise Peete, now living elsewhere in Los Angeles, still neatly dressed, still composed. On 12/30/1920, she was arrested and informed that she was charged with the murder of Jacob Denton. It was reported that she denied killing him and insisted that he had gone away of his own will, but the grave beneath the basement and the bullet lodged in his skull now spoke more loudly than any defense she could offer on the street. In early 1921, the Superior Court in Los Angeles convened to hear the case of the People versus Louise Peete. For weeks, the courtroom drew crowds. Men and women filled the benches, the air thickening during long afternoons as the murmur of shifting bodies and rustling garments rose and fell. At the defense table sat Louise, well dressed despite her confinement, her posture straight, her face controlled, as if she were attending a social engagement rather than a proceeding that might end her life. The prosecution constructed a careful chain. Jacob Denton, last seen alive at his home in late 1920. His new tenant, Louise Peete, moving in just before his disappearance. The sudden cessation of his public life. her instructions to have soil brought into the basement, her use of his automobile and jewelry, her signing of checks in his name. Witness after witness testified. Neighbors who no longer saw Denton, bank employees who processed dubious transactions, laborers who carried earth into the cellar, servants who heard her explanations about a supposed injury or a journey to Mexico. Medical witnesses described the bullet wound to his head, the later cut to his throat, and the circumstances of the grave beneath the house. For the defense, the argument was more elusive. Counsel suggested that others might have been involved, that Louise herself had been misled or threatened, that Denton's life held complications unknown to those in court. At various times, she claimed that a disfigured woman or dangerous associates had come into the house and played the chief part in his fate, leaving her frightened and compelled to keep silent. Her attorneys emphasized that she had not fled the city immediately, that she had maintained the property and spoken openly with many people. They tried to suggest that her reason had been overborne by fear rather than guided by calculation. When she addressed the court, her voice was controlled rather than broken. She denied shooting Jacob Denton, denied cutting his throat, and described herself as the victim of others' plots and of cruel misinterpretation. But the jury had before them the cold facts of the grave, the bullet, the forged checks, and her months of comfortable occupation of the dead man's house. They returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. The judge pronounced the usual sentence for such a crime: death. Yet in the months that followed, the penalty was reduced to life imprisonment, the authorities choosing to commute her sentence on account of her sex. Louise Peete was sent to the state prison to spend, as it then appeared, the rest of her life behind high walls and locked doors. For 18 years after her conviction, Louise Peete lived as a life prisoner, her world reduced to barred windows, institutional clothing, and the strict routines of a women's prison. The rooms there were bare, the air sharp with disinfectant, the days marked by the clang of doors and the shuffle of regulated footsteps. Over time, she gained a reputation for steady conduct. In 1939, with the support of a well-to-do woman named Margaret Logan, who had come to know her and believe in her reformation, she was paroled. Margaret and her husband, Arthur Logan, took her into their Los Angeles home as a housekeeper and companion. It was a comfortable dwelling with a small garden and rose bushes, the sort of place where the furniture shone from regular polishing and the evenings were quiet. Yet within a few years, that quiet turned ominous. In 1944, Margaret Logan vanished from sight, and Louise explained that she had gone away for a rest. On 12/22/1944, Margaret's body was found on the property, beaten and shot, hastily buried beneath a rosebush in a way grimly reminiscent of Jacob Denton's resting place. On 12/28/1944, Louise Peete was arrested once more. In 1945, she was tried again for first-degree murder. This time the parallels were too stark, the public patience too thin. The prosecution pointed to the repeated pattern: a benefactor disappearance, control of property, a grave on the grounds. The defense could not overcome the weight of this history. She was convicted and sentenced to death. On 04/11/1947 at San Quentin prison, she was led into the gas chamber. At 10:04 in the morning, the execution began. Those present later recalled that she thanked the prison chaplain quietly before the chamber was sealed. She remains the only woman ever executed by gas in the state of California. Her name endures in the darker annals of American crime. A woman sentenced to death twice, who moved repeatedly into the homes and confidence of those who later died or vanished. Was Louise Peete a cold, deliberate destroyer who used charm as a shield while she cleared her path of those who stood in it? Or was she, in some measure, a product of a world that prized outward grace more than it questioned the stories behind it? Did her final punishment at San Quentin truly settle the debts owed to Jacob Denton and Margaret Logan? Or did it simply close one more door on motives that remain cloudy even now? And in modern cities, where neighbors often know little of one another's private lives, is it impossible that a similarly composed figure could once again move from house to house, leaving silence and missing names behind? The path from the superstitious shadows of the 18th century with Mary Bateman through the stark destitution of Victorian London with Sarah Jane Whiteling, and into the glamorous deceit of the early 20th century with Louise Peete, reveals a constant and unsettling truth. These stories, disparate in their social context, are all bound by the quiet, tragic failure of trust. One woman exploited fear, one exploited desperation, and one exploited vanity. We must look beyond the final verdict and ask, is true wickedness simply the ability to manipulate the specific weakness of an era? And are we, across the centuries, any better at discerning and stopping these twisted pressures? If these starkly contrasting histories resonate with you, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel so we may continue to exhume the true history of crime.